my generation. I mean, many politicians of my age think it is a panacea that will change the health service or the education or the economy. It's a very powerful and sophisticated tool, but it is just that, a tool. And I think people, when they're making art, need to be reminded of it, that it is just a tool. And just because you're able to do it doesn't mean it's interesting or any good. And I think that, often in a technological sense, people are blinded by the amazing things we can do with technology, but what they're doing with it is a bit lame. If you remember that film Tron. My daughter's 17, so I do see her. If we're going to have a sort of definition of the Facebook generation, I think she is. She was a toddler when the internet really started taking off, so she's sort of grown up with it, and she takes it for granted like we take electricity for granted. And just as my generation, I suppose, thought the internet's this amazing thing, and the Victorians thought electricity could solve everything, and I think we think like that. But I can remember when my daughter was very young, we were in the park, and she pointed to a lake, and she said, "Click on that swan." And that is the power of the internet. That is the power of it. Because it has this power to really inveigle its way into our minds, because we're sitting there on our own quite often, and it is grafting itself onto our grey matter. And there's pluses and minuses about it. I mean, I don't know if it's true. I've been talking to my friends who are kind of educators in the art field, and they seem to think there is this sort of one-click attitude to creativity now, where if something doesn't come up on the first 10 hits of Facebook, of Google, it doesn't exist. And digital communication encourages a kind of superficiality relationship to the real world, if you know what I mean. On Facebook, you are either a friend or you're not a friend. There isn't the in-between, like the person you know but you don't really want to have dinner with, or the person you'll have the weekend with but you wouldn't necessarily want to marry. There's grades of friendship. The real world is very nuanced, and often binary technology, which we've got a reminder it's on or off, hasn't got that. And maybe it will happen, I don't know. I know from bitter experience that the real satisfaction from making art comes from sort of a long relationship with things, setbacks, and I think that the cyber world that my daughter and her generation are growing up into, it has this ability to confuse ideas and experiences. So they think that if they understand something, they're somehow appreciating it and living it. It's like we're going to have a whole generation who are brilliant at answering pub quizzes, but they may struggle with processes that need more long experience and exposure and feedback from the other world. Though I was talking to someone recently who was an expert in computer art, and he said that often when you go to a computer art conference, people talk about code like a woodcarver would talk about wood, and code has knots in it, and it feeds back. It's so complex and vast, the information that is available, that it does produce unexpected results. Also, there's this idea now that I see that seems to have seeped into popular consciousness. And I think the turning point for me was when that terrorist was storming the Irish Parliament, and he said, "Oh, it's not a terrorist plot, it's a piece of performance art." And that was a turning point for me, in that now in the popular consciousness, anything unusual is art. And that kind of, as an artist, that slightly galls me. Because, yeah, it may be art, and you can call it art, but, it's no good. It's not very interesting. Mind you, maybe terrorism as art would be quite exciting, I don't know. My objection to the idea, really, of a totally digital culture, which I think, there's this sort of, again, this sort of fetishization of it now, and sort of Stephen Fry sort of masturbating his Apple phone on television and everything. People are, because it's very Boise as well, is that whatever you do with it, digital culture, basically you're stuck in front of a screen with a mouse. And I use computers myself to make things. I've just completed a huge tapestry that I partly designed and was programmed and was made by a computer-controlled loom. But there's something that was lacking in it, which is that sort of tactile relationship with materials. That is a kind of feedback loop. And the delivery systems often of digital culture, if you sort of digital printers or I've used a lot of digital transfers in ceramics. There's a sort of thinness about it as yet. I mean, the delivery systems will get better, but I find myself actually factoring in mistakes in order to make them look a bit human, because I think that there is, I mean, Islamic artists, they often deliberately put in a mistake because only God can be perfect. And I think in another, if you turn that on its head, you put in the mistakes because only humans can make mistakes. And I think that that's an interesting sort of idea. Also, that I think that one of the plus sides of coming out of the sort of digital culture is that there is a hunger. Here we are all today, all these people have come here today, to a live event. And I think there is a hunger for live events and festivals, and you know, often there's sort of fashions for kind of like quaint old crafts like knitting and things like that. They are, I think, partly in response to this idea that people are just sat in front of a screen now because everybody's job now is basically sitting in front of a computer. And I'm often roped in as the sort of poster boy stroke girl of the handmade craft. But I don't fetishize it particularly myself. I mean, from the very off, one of the things I used to say was, give me a microwave kiln, because a lot of potters used to talk about the gifts of the fire, you know, and I always used to think of the gifts my auntie gave me at Christmas. But, you know, I think there are limitations as yet. I mean, what I'm really sort of pitching here is that the Facebook generation will grow up with computers. I think we're at the very beginning of digital culture, and it will produce things that are, you know, that have a more satisfying end product, I suppose, in the end. I mean, computers, as yet, they don't dip their paintbrush into your cup of tea or the wrong colour, and they don't necessarily, you know, they don't misregister and things like that. You know, the kind of little sort of human quirks that I like in art. So I believe that we are at the beginning, and the Facebook generation, of course, they will produce brilliant artists. They might be making art that we can't even imagine as yet because of the power of the computer, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Last and by no means least is Stephen Bayley. Stephen Bayley was the founding director of London's Design Museum, but he's much more than that. He's a consultant, a designer, journalist, broadcaster, with a waspish tongue, but with wisdom as well. So, Stephen Bayley.
I sort of don't see any reason why I shouldn't join the parade of casuistry, which we've already enjoyed, because there is some equivocation about what the subject actually is. I mean, as Grayson and others have said, I mean, we're all bored by the question of what is art, but are we actually talking here about art appreciation? I mean, I think it would be terribly arrogant of us to suggest that the Facebook generation doesn't spend enough time contemplating its Pizarros, or indeed its Gormleys or Perrys. Or are we actually talking about educating the Facebook generation in the practice of art? Are we actually saying that we're dealing with millions and millions of young people who are brutally de-skilled, Philistine collective who can't or don't want to draw or paint or pot or sculpt? Or maybe we're actually discussing something much, much, much more occult, the actual mystery of creativity and whether that can be taught, and I'll come to that in about 4.5 minutes' time. Anyway, the point is, of course, as others have said before me, of course you can teach art appreciation and art practice. It seems to me the subsidiary question here is, why exactly would you want to? I mean, some would say, many people would argue, it's an assumption of our culture that art appreciation can actually do no harm. But sometimes I actually wonder. There's a notably high level of art appreciation amongst very ugly despots and vulgarians. The art world itself, come on, let's be honest. What a terrible collection of backstabbing, me-first, politicking operators there are in this community. I mean, if the appreciation of art has civilizing effects, they're not to be found in the commercial art world or in the civic museums and galleries. I mean, I spent many years working in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and it was completely undermined my belief in, as I said, the humanizing effect of beauty.